Title: The Game Beyond the Screen. Chapter 1: The Forbidden Game. The Encounter. Ethan had always considered himself a skeptic. For years he'd laughed off the rumors about cursed video games, dismissing them as mere stories designed to stir up fear. After all, everyone had heard the tales. Games that made players disappear, videos that forced themselves onto your screen, glitches that couldn't be explained. He was one of those people who rolled their eyes whenever someone brought up the latest horror story circulating the internet. But even the most hardened cynics are sometimes caught off guard. It was late on a Friday evening when Ethan's curiosity led him to the dark corners of the internet. He had been scrolling through an obscure forum when he came across a thread titled, "The Game Beyond the Screen." His pulse quickened as he read through it. The message was brief, and the reply from the original poster was cryptic. "Don't play it. It knows. It will never let you leave." The warning made his skin crawl. Despite his usual disinterest in things like this, he couldn't help but click the link. Maybe it was the sense of excitement, or the desire to prove that he wasn't one to shy away from challenges. Either way, curiosity gnawed at him, and he found himself entering the world of Dark Razor. The download link looked completely unremarkable. No hidden code, no strange characters. The file size was small, only a few megabytes, which was odd considering the intensity of the claims he'd read. Still, Ethan hit the download button without hesitation. If it was a virus, well, it was just another lesson in caution. But Ethan had seen and dismissed so many urban legends that he wasn't worried. The game was nothing special when it launched. The graphics were basic, almost rudimentary, and the music was an eerie looping tune that seemed to crawl under his skin. The game's title screen was simple: Dark Razor, written in jagged red text against a black background. But what unnerved him immediately was the tagline below the title: "You can't stop what has already begun." That was all. No instruction, no start screen. It just began. The game begins. Ethan immediately realized something was wrong. The game started with an image of a twisted, distorted version of his own room. His desk, his chair, his bed, it all looked the same, but there was a sickening difference to everything. The colors were muted and unnatural, the shadows too deep, the corners of the room too dark. A feeling of dread lingered in the air like the faintest hum, almost like an electric charge building up in his body. Something about this was off. Something was wrong. He clicked on the screen, selecting the first option: enter the house. The world around him blurred for a second. Ethan blinked, and when his vision cleared, he was no longer sitting in his chair. His surroundings had changed. He was standing in the middle of the very room the game had shown him. But now it felt as if it were suffocating him. The walls seemed to close in. The shadows moved like creeping fingers. And the silence. Oh God, the silence. It was deafening. Ethan quickly clicked through the game's mechanics, trying to find any indication of what to do next. But the screen was blank save for one glowing door across the room. It beckoned him with an unnatural allure. A chill ran down his spine as his hand trembled on the mouse. But there was no turning back. He had already crossed the line. He clicked. The door creaked open slowly and he stepped through into another room. This one was a long hallway, stretching farther than he could see. As Ethan walked forward, he noticed something faintly glowing at the end of the hallway. It was a door, but this one wasn't like the others. It was ancient, covered in symbols and markings that made no sense. They seemed to writhe under his gaze, shifting between shapes that were both familiar and yet utterly alien. The closer Ethan got, the more he could hear something faint, a whisper. At first, he thought it was part of the game's eerie atmosphere, but as he strained his ears, he realized it was real. A voice, coming from the speakers. It wasn't a voice in the game, though. It was coming from the real world. "Ethan, Ethan, come closer." The voice was cold, distant, but unmistakably familiar. It was his mother's voice. He froze, heart pounding in his chest. He'd never heard a game do anything like this before. But as the whisper repeated his name, Ethan's instincts screamed at him to leave. He wanted to pull the plug, shut down the game, and never look back. But before he could even move the mouse, The door opened on its own, and the screen shifted again. The game distorts reality. The room was darker now. A heavy mist swirled through the air, crawling up the walls, thick as fog. He had no control over his character, no way to navigate, no ability to run. All he could do was walk, and the door beckoned him once again. Reluctantly, Ethan moved forward. With each step, the walls seemed to grow taller, the shadows deeper, the whispers louder. By the time he reached the door, something had changed. The whispers stopped. The room in the game was now a warped reflection of his own. The same items were scattered across the floor. His textbooks, his phone, his favorite hoodie, but they were all wrong. The books were upside down, the phone cracked, and the hoodie was torn in ways that suggested something violent had happened. Then, the screen flickered. A message appeared, written in bold, blood-red text. "You should have never played this game, Ethan. It knows you now, and it won't let you leave." The words were more than just a warning. They were a promise. A jolt of fear surged through Ethan's chest. His breath quickened, his palms sweating. The room around him began to distort further. Furniture shifting out of place, the walls collapsing inwards. The game, it seemed, had noticed him. With a panicked click, he tried to quit the game, but nothing happened. The screen remained locked in place, the whispers returning louder now, overlapping in an unintelligible cacophony. Ethan's heart pounded as he struggled, his hand desperately trying to press the power button on his computer. But it didn't matter. The game wasn't going to let him go. The game had already begun. Chapter 1. Part 2. The game's grip tightens. The shadows in the room. Ethan's heart thudded violently in his chest as the whispers around him grew louder, almost as though the walls themselves were closing in. His eyes darted back and forth across the screen. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch unnaturally, their shapes flickering like dark tendrils trying to reach out and grab him. Every corner of the room he stood in felt like it was alive, watching him. He clenched his fists, trying to steady his breath. "It's just a game," he muttered to himself. But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the gnawing sense that something far darker was at play here. The normal rules of gaming, the expectations of logic and control, had been shattered the moment he had clicked to play Dark Razor. The computer screen flickered again, and a new message appeared. "Don't look away." His breath caught in his throat. The text wasn't just a warning, it was a command. A sick, creeping sensation ran down his spine. What did it mean? Don't look away from what? He turned his head, his gaze shifting to the left, where the darkness seemed to be pooling. The shadows there were no longer just shadows. They had shape, and they were moving. He tried to look back at the screen, but the image on the monitor was now shifting, warping in a way he couldn't explain. The distorted version of his room seemed to twist, the furniture becoming more and more alien, as if the game was bleeding into the real world. His own reflection began to distort in the glass of his computer monitor, his face blurring out like a puddle of ink spilling across the screen. "No," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible over the rising cacophony of whispers. The shadows in the corners of his room began to stir. A cold chill swept through the air, like something ancient was awakening in the space around him. His eyes widened as a shape began to materialize in the corner of the room. It was faint at first, a mere silhouette, but then it grew clearer, its form taking on a twisted, unnatural shape. A figure with too many limbs, its face a grotesque mask of jagged features, slowly turning toward him. The whispers stopped abruptly, and in the eerie silence, Ethan could hear the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. Something was moving. Something was alive in his room. His mind raced. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. It's the game. The game is messing with me. He reached forward, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the keyboard, trying to close the application. But before he could hit the escape key, the figure in the corner of the room smiled. A sick, unnerving smile that made Ethan's stomach twist. It wasn't the face of a person, but something far worse, a thing that shouldn't be. Suddenly, the lights in his room flickered violently, and for a split second, the game's distorted version of the room was reflected in the darkness. He could see himself, standing frozen in place, his hands gripping the sides of his desk, but it wasn't him. It was something else, a twisted mockery of himself, smiling back at him with cold, dead eyes. He stumbled back from the desk, his breath coming in shallow gasps. But the thing on the screen, no, the thing in his room, didn't stop. It stepped closer, dragging itself toward him with the slow, deliberate pace of a predator stalking its prey. The room felt colder. Ethan forced himself to move. He grabbed the mouse and clicked frantically, trying to exit the game, but nothing happened. His mouse moved in a slow, disjointed manner, like it was being tugged by some unseen force. The edges of the screen began to crack, the lines of code fracturing into distorted shapes, blinking red and black in a chaotic strobe. Then, the figure in the corner of the room spoke. "It's too late." The voice echoed around him, not from the game, but from his very room. His breath hitched, the words sinking in like ice in his veins. The figure smiled again, and this time, Ethan saw the empty space where its eyes should have been, black as void, sucking in the light. "We are watching. We are already inside." His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor. The chair behind him creaked as it shifted, as if pushed by some invisible hand. His eyes were locked on the screen, where the message flashed again. "You cannot escape." Ethan slammed his hand against the power button on his computer, but it wouldn't turn off. The screen pulsed with an unsettling glow, and as he looked up, the figure in his room had stepped closer, right in front of him now. It stood mere inches from him, its limbs unnaturally long, twisted in ways that no human form could ever stretch. It reached out, and as its hand extended, the room seemed to fold in on itself, the walls bending and twisting into impossible angles. The air was thick with a suffocating pressure, and the room itself felt like it was collapsing, becoming smaller and smaller, until there was only him and the creature. It loomed over him, its lips curling into a grin that stretched impossibly wide, revealing sharp, serrated teeth. The thing whispered again, the voice now a raspy, guttural growl. "Play or die." Ethan's breath was ragged. He had to do something. Anything. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, he grabbed the keyboard, his hands flying across the keys. But the moment his fingers touched the keys, the screen froze. Time itself seemed to stop. The whispers faded, and the figure in his room went still. The whole room seemed to hold its breath, caught in some terrible limbo. Then, the figure stepped back and disappeared into the shadows, its face now a faint memory. The walls returned to their original form. The air cleared, and the oppressive weight that had been crushing his chest lifted. Ethan's body was drenched in sweat, his heart still pounding. The game had stopped, but the damage had already been done. Ethan was no longer alone in his room. His hands were shaking as he stood up, looking around frantically. His mind raced. What just happened? Was it the game? Had the game somehow bled into reality? He turned to his desk, his eyes falling on the reflection in the darkened screen. But this time, there was something different about the reflection. It was still smiling. Chapter 2. The Whispering Door. The following morning, Ethan woke with the stench of sweat clinging to his skin, his mind still clouded with the remnants of the nightmare. But this time, the nightmare had felt too real. The figure, that unnerving presence in his room, wasn't a mere figment of his imagination, nor was it confined to the pixels on his screen. Something had seeped from the game into his world. The shadows, the whispers, they were real. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, pale and muted, but Ethan felt no warmth. He hadn't slept properly, hadn't slept soundly in weeks, but this felt different. The air in his apartment was thick, heavy with an unnatural weight that had been absent before. Even as he lay there, blinking up at the ceiling, the room seemed slightly off-center, its proportions subtly askew. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking the eerie silence. The sudden vibration was enough to jolt him out of his stupor. He sat up in bed, feeling the dry cotton of his shirt against his skin, and reached for the phone. 1. New message. David. "Hey man, you okay? You went dark last night. I tried calling, but your phone was off. The game okay? I know it's kind of unsettling, but you got to keep playing, right?" Ethan stared at the message, his hands trembling as he typed a response. Yeah, it was fine. Just tired. I'll be at work in a few hours. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to write next. Should he tell David? Should he tell anyone? The truth, as he now knew it, was far too insane to explain. No one would believe me. He couldn't even explain it to himself. The room had felt alive, like a living thing. And the whispering had been so distinct, so personal. That thing, the one from the screen, it hadn't been a ghost or a hallucination, or just some effect of a horror game. It had felt purposeful. There was a knock at his door. Soft, gentle, but distinct. Ethan froze, his blood running cold. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 10:30 a.m. His neighbor, Mr. Gorman, never knocked before noon. Ethan wasn't expecting anyone. The knock came again. He hesitated. He didn't want to open the door, didn't want to acknowledge the possibility that someone else might be involved in this madness. But his curiosity, his unshakable sense of dread, drove him to his feet. As he approached the door, the room seemed to darken even further. The shadows in the corners of the apartment seemed to deepen, stretching longer and further, inching closer to him. The doorbell rang once, sharply, as if the person on the other side knew he was just moments from opening it. What if it's the game? What if it's come here, to my doorstep? He reached for the doorknob, his palm cold and clammy. With a twist, the door creaked open. Standing there was a man he didn't recognize, tall, with sharp features, and an expression that could only be described as knowing, almost predatory. He wore a dark suit which looked out of place for a Saturday morning. His tie was slightly loosened, the collar of his shirt undone. The man's eyes, grey as storm clouds, locked onto Ethan's without a hint of surprise, as though he'd been expecting this encounter for some time. Ethan's heart raced, his breath catching in his throat. The man didn't smile. Instead, he spoke, his voice low and unsettling. "I need you to come with me." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, to slam the door in his face, but no words came out. His throat had tightened, his pulse quickening. "Come with me. It's time," the man repeated, his voice carrying a strange, hypnotic cadence. Ethan shook his head, trying to gather his wits. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man's lips twitched at the corners, a thin smile barely forming. "You know exactly what I want. It's about the game, Ethan." The words hit Ethan like a slap to the face, his knees buckling slightly. "What do you know about the game?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man's gaze softened, almost sympathetically. "It's not just a game, is it? It never was. And it's not just about you anymore. It's here." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The man's words echoed in his mind, each one heavier than the last. "It's here." Without thinking, Ethan stepped back, eyes darting to the hallway behind the stranger, as though there might be a way to escape. But the man's hand shot out faster than Ethan could react, pressing against the doorframe with unrelenting force. The coldness that emanated from him seemed to permeate the space around them, seeping into Ethan's skin, chilling his bones. "You're already marked, Ethan. You signed the contract the moment you downloaded that game." The door slammed shut in Ethan's face before he could protest further. The man wasn't gone, though. His voice lingered in the air like a low hum. "Don't bother running. There's nowhere to hide." Ethan backed away from the door, his body trembling uncontrollably. His mind raced. The words were too precise, too knowing. His gaze turned to the computer screen, now dark and silent on his desk. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. How did he know? With his heart hammering in his chest, Ethan finally sat at the desk, pulling the mouse toward him. His fingers shook as they hovered over the mouse. He couldn't stop now. He knew he couldn't. The game had already been etched into the fabric of his reality, like a parasite crawling beneath his skin. There was no escaping it now. The screen flickered on, but this time it didn't show the usual loading screen. Instead, a distorted image of the man who had just visited him appeared, standing in a dark alleyway, his face blurred, his features almost too sharp to be human. "Come and find me, Ethan," the distorted voice said, though the mouth on the screen didn't move. "You can't run from the game. Ethan's chest tightened. Sweat poured down his face. This isn't real. This isn't happening. But the longer he stared at the screen, the more real it all seemed. In that moment, the world around him began to blur again. The walls of his apartment started to shift, bending in ways they shouldn't. The shadows that had once been harmless objects in the corners of his room now stretched impossibly far, their dark fingers crawling across the floor toward him. Ethan's vision blurred as the screen went black again. He heard the sound of a door opening, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps approaching from behind. His breath caught in his throat. The game was far from over. Chapter 3: The Spiral of Control. Ethan sat at his desk, staring blankly at the darkened screen of his computer. His chest rose and fell with shallow, uneven breaths, each one catching in his throat as if the weight of the air itself was pressing against him. The apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of the overhead light. But even the silence wasn't comforting. It felt alive, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him out of his thoughts. He grabbed it quickly, hoping for a distraction. But when he saw the screen, his blood turned to ice. The notification wasn't from any app he recognized. It was a simple message, written in bold red letters. Level 2 has begun. Ethan dropped the phone as if it had burned him. It clattered onto the desk, the screen facing upward, the message still glaring at him. He hadn't touched the game since the previous night. He hadn't even opened the application again. How could the game progress on its own? His hands trembled as he picked up the phone. He tapped the screen, trying to clear the message, but nothing happened. The words remained, bold and unyielding. After a moment, the screen flickered and another message appeared. You can't stop now. Complete the level. No, Ethan whispered, shaking his head. No, I'm done. I'm not playing this anymore. But the game had other plans. The computer screen blinked to life, illuminating the room with an eerie glow. Ethan's stomach twisted as the familiar title screen of Darkrazor appeared, the jagged red text pulsing like a heartbeat. Beneath the title, a new message scrawled itself across the screen. Play or pay the price. Ethan's breath hitched. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows on the walls lengthening unnaturally. He could feel something watching him, its presence heavy and oppressive. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to run as far from this cursed game as possible. But his legs wouldn't move. His body felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear so primal it drowned out all reason. And then, the whispers returned. They were faint at first, barely audible, like a soft breeze brushing past his ears. But they grew louder, more insistent, until they were a cacophony of voices overlapping and echoing through his mind. Finish the level, Ethan. You're already in. There's no escape. His hands moved of their own accord, drawn toward the keyboard like magnets. No matter how much he fought it, he couldn't resist. His fingers hovered over the keys, trembling as the game loaded the next level. Rebardemi from the second level. The screen transitioned to a dark, fog-filled landscape. The environment was eerily familiar, a warped version of the neighborhood Ethan had grown up in. The houses were distorted, their windows shattered, and the trees lining the streets twisted into unnatural shapes. The air in the game was thick with a grey mist that obscured everything beyond a few feet. Ethan's character, a shadowy version of himself, stood in the middle of the street, surrounded by an oppressive silence. A single prompt appeared on the screen. Find the mark. He had no idea what it meant, but the game offered no explanation. There were no instructions, no tutorial, no guidance. Just the command. His character began to move forward, his footsteps echoing eerily in the fog. Ethan felt his own heart rate sink with the rhythm of those steps, each one drawing him deeper into the unknown. As he walked, strange things began to happen. The fog around him seemed to whisper, faint voices calling his name, their tones laced with malice. Shapes moved in the distance, just beyond his vision, their outlines blurry and indistinct. Every so often, a shadow would dart across the screen, too fast for him to track. And then, he saw it. A figure stood at the end of the street, barely visible through the haze. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an unsettling angle. Ethan's character stopped moving, but the figure didn't. It began to walk toward him, slow and deliberate, its movements jerky and inhuman. Ethan's fingers tightened around the mouse. "No," he muttered. "No, no, no!" The figure drew closer, and as it did, the game's perspective shifted. The camera zoomed in on the figure's face, revealing hollow eyes and a jagged, toothy grin that stretched far too wide. Its mouth moved, but no sound came out. Instead, the whispers around him grew louder, forming words that sent chills down his spine. "It's all your fault." The screen flickered, and for a moment, Ethan thought he saw his own reflection in the figure's hollow eyes. Panic surged through him. He moved the mouse frantically, trying to get away, but the game wouldn't let him. His character stood frozen as the figure reached out, its skeletal hand extending toward the screen. And then, it spoke. "Do you remember?" Ethan gasped. The voice wasn't coming from the game. It was coming from behind him. He spun around, his chair creaking loudly, but the room was empty. His heart raced as he scanned the shadows, his breath coming in shallow gasps. There was nothing there, just the dim light of the computer screen and the oppressive silence of his apartment. But when he turned back to the screen, the figure was gone. The mark. The game's environment had changed. The fog had cleared, revealing a desolate landscape that resembled a graveyard. The tombstones were cracked and weathered, their surfaces etched with illegible writing. Ethan's character stood in the middle of the cemetery, surrounded by an eerie stillness. A new prompt appeared on the screen. "Find the truth." Ethan hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keys. He didn't want to go any further, but he knew he had no choice. The game wouldn't let him stop. It never let him stop. He guided his character through the graveyard, the sound of crunching gravel echoing in his ears. The whispers had returned, softer now, almost mournful. They spoke of regret, of guilt, of things long buried. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The atmosphere was suffocating, the air thick with an unspoken tension. And then he saw it. A single grave, set apart from the others, bathed in an unnatural light. The headstone was pristine, its surface unmarred by time or decay. As Ethan's character approached, the writing on the headstone became clear. Ethan Ward, 1996, 2023. He couldn't let go. The blood drained from Ethan's face. His hands shook violently as he stared at the screen, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. The screen flickered again, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became deafening. Ethan clutched his head, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voices were inside his mind, clawing at his thoughts, tearing at his sanity. And then the screen went black. For a moment, there was silence. And then a final message appeared. Level 3 will begin soon. Ethan collapsed back in his chair, his body trembling. The game wasn't over. It was far from over. Chapter 4: The Descent into the Abyss. Ethan felt the weight of his own breath in his lungs, each inhalation sharp and unnatural, as though the very air in the room had turned against him. His fingers hovered over the mouse, hesitant, trembling. A sense of dread settled in his chest, an oppressive force that refused to leave, lingering like smoke that had seeped into his very skin. He had finished level 2, the graveyard, but his mind was still clouded with the strange message he had received. Level 3 will begin soon, but there was no choice. Oh, the game demanded more, pulling him back, deeper into the labyrinth of his own nightmare. Ethan clicked the mouse without thinking, almost as though his body had betrayed his will. The screen flickered for a split second, and in that instant, a chill ran through him. The temperature in the room had dropped, a strange draft seeping under the door, as though the very walls were exhaling something foul, something ancient. The screen blinked back to life, the text that appeared on it unmistakable. Welcome to the Abyss. The words seemed to sink into the room, twisting around him like an invisible thread, drawing him closer to the game's dark promise. The phrase itself felt wrong, too final, too absolute. Ethan didn't want to press forward. Every instinct screamed at him to shut off the computer, to destroy it if necessary. But his hands refused to obey. They were controlled now by something else, something far darker than the game itself. "The abyss," he murmured aloud, testing the words. They tasted like ash on his tongue. Suddenly, a sound, an unnatural groan, filled the room. The familiar hum of the computer was replaced by something else, a low vibration that seemed to crawl under his skin, making his nerves spark. Ethan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the floor. His heart was pounding, the rhythm erratic as his pulse echoed in his ears. He turned to the window, but the outside world looked unchanged, quiet, still. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. He looked back at the screen, the words on it now consuming the whole display. "Enter the darkness." With a final reluctant breath, Ethan clicked the enter key. The beginning of level 3. The game loaded, and this time, Ethan wasn't sure what he expected. But it wasn't this. The landscape that unfolded before him was nothing like the familiar world he'd walked through before. It wasn't a mere twist of his hometown. This was something new, something alien. A void, an endless expanse of nothing. He could feel the weight of it in his chest. The crushing emptiness that seemed to stretch out far beyond the screen. It was dark. Not just blackness, but an endless, suffocating darkness that pressed in from all sides, as though the entire world had been swallowed whole by it. There was no sky, no ground, just an abyss stretching to the horizon, a blackness so deep it seemed to absorb light itself. Ethan's character stood at the edge of this void, a tiny figure dwarfed by the overwhelming emptiness. The world felt empty. No wind, no trees, no sound. The silence was deafening, the stillness suffocating. And then, as he moved the character forward, something shifted. A sound, a low, almost imperceptible hum, began to reverberate through the air. It was distant at first, like the sound of 1,000 whispers, too faint to distinguish, but soon it grew louder, until it became a maddening buzz, filling the void with its endless drone. "What is this?" Ethan whispered to himself. "Where am I?" His character moved, though he didn't want it to. His hand shook as he maneuvered the keys, trying to find some way to stop this descent into madness. There was no objective now, no clear path to follow. Just the sense of being trapped in a nightmare. Each step felt heavier than the last. Each breath felt more shallow. The hum grew louder, turning into a distorted, static-laced scream, as if the world itself were tearing apart at the seams. Ethan's eyes darted to the screen. Something was emerging from the blackness. A shadow at first, a flicker of movement, too quick to identify. But then it came into full view, a shape, long and elongated. Tall, so tall it seemed to stretch beyond the limits of the screen itself. Its outline was hazy, shifting in and out of view like a mirage. But Ethan could feel it. This thing was watching him. Its form was thin, skeletal almost, and its face, if you could even call it a face, was blank, an expanse of white skin stretched taut over sharp bone. Two hollow, empty sockets stared into the darkness, voids that swallowed any light near them. It stood motionless in the middle of the void, but Ethan knew it was aware of him. It wasn't moving, but it felt alive. The game's prompt flickered on the screen. "Do you remember it?" Ethan's hands froze on the keyboard. His heart skipped a beat. The voice in his head, a whisper, distant but familiar, grew louder. "Do you remember?" The question echoed, sending shivers down his spine. He couldn't remember anything. He couldn't recall how he had ended up here. The only thing he remembered was the constant presence of the game, the compulsion to keep playing, to keep moving forward no matter the cost. The creature on the screen seemed to tilt its head as if considering him, studying him. And then, without warning, it began to move. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It simply glided, sliding through the void, moving toward him faster than any human could ever run. Ethan's character instinctively backed away, his heart racing. He slammed the keyboard, trying to move the character in the opposite direction. But the game resisted. The figure drew closer with every second. It felt as if the walls of his apartment had begun to close in, the oppressive atmosphere of the game spilling out into his reality, suffocating him. And then, just as the creature reached the edge of the screen, it stopped. The hum intensified again, but now it was different. It was no longer a distant sound, but a wave of pure static that felt as though it was crashing directly into Ethan's ears, his mind. The words appeared on the screen again, now bold and jagged. "You are the game now!" A scream tore from Ethan's throat, though no sound left his lips. The world around him seemed to bend, twist, as if the very fabric of reality was warping in front of him. He blinked, and when he opened his eyes again, the creature was no longer on the screen. It was in the room. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he spun around. His heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced to comprehend what he was seeing. The figure stood in the corner of the room, its long, skeletal form stretching from the floor to the ceiling. Its eyes, empty, hollow pits, were trained on him. Its mouth, wide and gaping, cracked open like the maw of some unholy beast. There was no sound, but Ethan could feel it. The presence of the thing was suffocating, filling every corner of the room, drowning him in its terrible, unyielding gaze. The whispers grew louder. "You can't escape. You're part of it now." His breath was coming in short gasps, his chest tight with panic. The game, the creature, it was all consuming him. Everything he had known, everything he had been, was slipping away. "Do you remember it now?" The whisper echoed again, but this time it was inside his own mind. It wasn't just the game anymore. The lines between reality and nightmare had dissolved, and Ethan understood. This wasn't just a game. It had always been him. Chapter 4, Part 2, The Abyss Beckons. Ethan's breath quickened, his chest constricting painfully as the room seemed to shrink around him. The thing in the corner, if it could even be called a thing, loomed, its unnatural presence filling every inch of space. The air was thick, oppressive, like something ancient and malevolent had decided to settle into his very bones. He could no longer hear the hum of the computer. The world outside the screen had fallen into a deep, horrifying silence, broken only by the terrifying whispers that crept into his thoughts, into his soul. "You can't escape. You're part of it now." The words echoed through his mind like a chant, a constant drumbeat of inevitability. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run, to flee from the horrific creature, but his legs were frozen, rooted to the floor, as though he had become an unwilling statue. His thoughts swirled in a haze of panic and confusion. The game, the thing in the room, was it real? Or was it all just some twisted, psychotic manifestation of his own fractured mind? He blinked hard, hoping that when he opened his eyes, the nightmare would be gone. But when his eyelids lifted, the creature was still there, standing in the same place, watching him with its empty, unblinking gaze. A cold sweat broke out across his brow, and the sharp, metallic taste of fear lingered in his mouth. His fingers instinctively reached for his phone, trembling as he grabbed it from his pocket. He was going to call for help. Anyone. But as he unlocked the screen, his heart sank. There were no signals, no bars. The phone was dead. Panic clawed at his throat. It felt as if the very world had been cut off from him, leaving him in this silent, haunted space with only the thing in the corner. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were being spoken by 1,000 voices from every direction. They grew indistinguishable, merging into one overwhelming chorus of terror. "You can't escape. You're part of it now." The words repeated endlessly, their meaning twisting in Ethan's mind. He stumbled backward, his legs weak, his body betraying him. He could feel the cold draft of air pushing against him, seeping under the door, through the cracks in the walls. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, as if the house itself were alive, hungry. His eyes darted to the clock on the wall. It was blinking erratically, each second stretching longer than the last. Suddenly, the figure moved, not with a sound or a noise, but with a terrifying fluidity. It glided toward him, its long, bony limbs stretching impossibly far, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It didn't seem to walk. It just moved. It was like a shadow come to life, drifting across the room, drawing closer with every second, the empty sockets of its face never leaving him. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His body was frozen, gripped by a force far beyond his control. He wanted to run, to turn and sprint out of the room, but his feet were like lead, rooted to the spot. The creature's head tilted to one side, the eerie silence filling the space once more. But now there was a suffocating tension to it. It was waiting, watching. The whispers intensified, turning into a maddening cacophony of voices, their words incoherent, but filled with a sickening rhythm. It was as if they were drawing closer, circling him, drowning him in their call. Then, from within the noise, one voice became clearer, more distinct. "Do you remember it now?" Ethan's eyes widened, his pulse racing in his ears as he tried to force himself to respond, to do something, but he could only stare at the creature. "Remember?" "What?" he whispered under his breath, his voice hoarse, trembling. The creature's lips, or what might have been lips, parted in a grotesque semblance of a grin. It was so wrong, so inhuman, the way the smile spread across its face, stretching unnaturally wide. The empty sockets of its eyes glowed faintly now, faint flickers of pale, sickly light, like the dying embers of a long-extinguished fire. The smile grew. The thing's head dipped toward him, as if it was savoring his fear, feeding off his confusion. Then, without warning, the room seemed to shift. The walls began to distort, pulling inward, and the air around him became thick and heavy. The corners of the room warped, bending like a funhouse mirror. Ethan could feel the floor beneath him quaking, the space around him growing unstable. He reached out, grabbing at the desk, at the chair, at anything to steady himself. But everything felt wrong, slippery, like the world itself was made of oil. His hands slid over the edges of the desk, over the smooth surface of the keyboard. "What do you want from me?" he cried out, his voice strained and panicked. The creature did not answer, but instead the whispers died down for a moment, replaced by a terrible, bone-chilling silence. And in that silence, a new voice emerged, a voice he knew. "Ethan, you have to listen to me." He froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was his brother's voice, James. It echoed through his mind, as clear as day. But there was something off. The tone was wrong, strained, as though something was forcing its way into the words. "You have to understand," the voice continued, growing more urgent. "It's not just the game. It's not just the thing in front of you. It's everything." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, a sense of vertigo sweeping over him. He tried to call out, but no words left his mouth. "It's never been a game, Ethan," the voice said, growing darker, more foreboding. "It's been watching you, following you, waiting for you to reach this point. You have to stop it. You have to stop before—" The voice cut off abruptly. The room fell silent again. The creature, which had been hovering just feet from him, remained motionless, its empty eyes fixed on him. And then, in the same motion as before, it moved again. But this time, the air around it seemed to twist, as if it were pulling something, someone, toward it. A shadowy, twisted figure appeared from the corner of his vision, crawling out from beneath the desk. A feeling of absolute dread washed over Ethan as he recognized it. James. His brother, or what was left of him, was crawling across the floor toward the creature. His eyes were wide and vacant, his skin pale, mottled with strange marks. His limbs moved in unnatural jerks, and as he crawled, Ethan could see the marks on his neck. The same ones he had seen in the game, in the reflections, in the endless abyss of the screen. "James, no!" Ethan cried, reaching out, but his voice was choked with fear. His brother's body was no longer his own, consumed by the same thing that had been chasing Ethan for so long. It was inside him now, pulling him toward the thing in the corner. The creature watched them both, its hollow gaze never leaving. The whispers returned, louder now, as if the very walls of the room were closing in on Ethan, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. "Do you remember?" The voice, James's voice, whispered, but this time it was not a question. It was a command. And then Ethan understood. The game, the thing in the corner, the presence in the air. It had never been a game. It had never been about winning or surviving. It had always been about drawing him in, consuming him, taking him into the abyss where nothing could escape. And now, the abyss had him. Chapter 5. The Spiral of Obsession. Ethan had never known such complete terror. The feeling wasn't just an emotion. It was something physical, a weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. The house, if it could even still be called that, had changed. It was no longer a familiar, silent home. It had become something else, something that watched. The walls hummed with a strange, low vibration, and the air felt thick, suffused with a presence he could not see but could feel in every corner, in every crevice of the house. Since that night, the hours had bled together, one indistinguishable from the next. Ethan found himself waking up in places he didn't remember going to sleep. His fingers would twitch, his mind would blur, and before he could pull himself back from the haze, he'd find himself standing in the dark, staring at the same glowing screen. The screen, the one he couldn't turn off, would flicker, illuminating his face with a pale, sickly light. The game, it had never really stopped, and neither had it. The whispers had gotten worse. They no longer just lingered in the corners of his mind. They were physical, pressing against his ears like 1,000 pinpricks of sound, voices clattering together in a tangled mess of words, a language that twisted and stretched just beyond comprehension. But the one thing Ethan could understand, the one phrase that had haunted him, was always the same. "You are mine now." It was an eerie, taunting voice, but sometimes, in the dark hours of the night, Ethan swore it was James's voice, his brother's familiar tone, warped and distorted. Other times it sounded like the thing in the corner of his room, the figure that had consumed his brother, but it didn't matter. Nothing made sense anymore. The world had shattered into pieces, and Ethan was caught in the middle, his mind spiraling deeper with every passing hour. He could still remember the first time he'd seen the creature in the corner. The way it moved, like it wasn't bound by the laws of the physical world, but something far more terrible, far more ancient. It didn't walk. It slid. It glided. And when it spoke, its voice reverberated in the pit of his stomach like an echo from the void. It had claimed him, just like it had claimed James. There was no escape. He could feel it now, the cold weight of the air around him as he sat frozen, hands gripped around the desk, staring at the screen. The game had updated, again. The image on the screen was distorted, but Ethan could still make out the familiar landscape of the game world, the city, the one that had become so eerily familiar over the past few days. It had once been a place of comfort, of challenge, but now it felt like a tomb, a prison. The game was still running, but something was different this time. A new window popped up, glowing ominously on the screen. A single line of text, flashing in the corner. "Do you want to remember?" Ethan recoiled, his heart hammering in his chest. This wasn't just a glitch. This wasn't part of the game. This was something else, something far more sinister. The cursor hovered over the yes and no buttons, but Ethan couldn't bring himself to click anything. His hand trembled in midair, his fingers flexing like they were fighting their own will. The whispers returned, louder this time, swirling around him like a suffocating fog. His vision blurred as the room seemed to grow colder, the walls breathing, expanding and contracting in time with his erratic heartbeat. There was something lurking within the game, something alive. He could feel it, crawling beneath his skin, wrapping itself around his thoughts, pulling him closer to the screen. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to stop, to turn away from the game, but he couldn't. It had him in its grip. He was the game now. A new message popped up on the screen. "The game remembers you." Ethan's hands shook violently as he reached for the mouse. His breath was coming in shallow gasps, his chest tight with fear. But the urge to click, to see what would happen next, was overpowering. With a final, trembling movement, he clicked, "Yes." and the room went silent. For a brief moment, Ethan thought he had done it. He thought that by refusing the invitation, he could have stopped it. He could have forced himself free from the pull of the game. But it was too late. His body was already sinking into it. As soon as he clicked the button, the room seemed to shudder. The floor beneath him groaned, and the walls contorted, their surfaces rippling like water. Ethan felt his stomach lurch as the ground seemed to split open beneath him. And before he could react, a tendril of darkness shot out from the screen, latching onto his chest with an icy grip. The force of it was overwhelming, like being dragged into a storm. His vision blurred, the room twisting around him. He could feel the game, it, pulling him into its cold, suffocating embrace. The screen flickered again, and the world around him seemed to collapse. His entire body spasmed as he felt himself pulled into the digital void, swallowed whole by the game. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. He opened his eyes. The room was still dark, still silent. But the atmosphere had changed. The air was different now, thicker, more oppressive. The walls were still, but they were alive, pulsing, as if they could breathe, as if they could feel. There was a low hum, a vibration in the air, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat when he saw it. The creature, the thing, was back. It had always been there, lurking in the shadows, watching him. But now it was no longer just an observer. It had crossed the threshold. It was part of this world now. It was in his world. The thing stood in the corner, its form distorted, barely recognizable. But this time, it was different. The figure in the corner was not just a haunting spectre. It was an extension of the game itself. Its eyes burned with an unnatural fire, and its grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that seemed to tear through the air itself. The whispers were louder now, filling the room, growing with every breath Ethan took. Ethan backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. The creature's form shimmered, like a mirage, and for a split second, it seemed to flicker between realities. It was the game. It was him. It was all the same now. There was no way out. He turned, desperate to escape, but the door was gone. The window was gone. The walls were closing in, the room narrowing around him, suffocating him. Every corner of the room was filled with the sound of that horrible whisper, 1,000 voices telling him the same thing. "You are mine now." Ethan's knees buckled as the weight of it all hit him. He could feel himself sinking, drawn further into the game, deeper into the nightmare. He was no longer separate from it. He was the game. He was the next level, the next piece of the puzzle. And as the creature moved closer, its form now fully realized, Ethan knew there would be no escape. There was no returning to the world he had known. The game had him. It had always had him, and it was never going to let him go. Chapter 5. The Spiral of Obsession. Part 2. Ethan's breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps. The air around him was thick, heavy, as though it were suffocating him. His chest constricted, his heart hammering violently against his ribcage. His mind felt as though it were being pulled in two directions at once, his body screaming for escape, while his hands, trembling and cold, moved slowly toward the screen. He wasn't controlling it, not really. The creature in the corner had stopped moving. It stood still now, its eyes fixed on him with an intensity that sent shivers running down his spine. The whispers, low and guttural, surrounded him, echoing off the walls. They were maddening, voices layering over one another in a constant, nauseating murmur. Ethan couldn't distinguish one from the other. It was a cacophony of intent and malice, each voice sharp and invasive. The creature shifted. It moved closer, but not in a conventional sense. The way it moved defied the laws of nature. It didn't walk. It slithered, or maybe floated would be a better word. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, joints twisting and snapping in ways that made Ethan's stomach churn. The air crackled with the energy of its presence, like the final moments before a storm. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. The blackness that enveloped it was not the absence of light, but an otherworldly darkness, swirling, tangible, hungry. The figure was tall, too tall, its form stretching unnaturally, its head too large, its features too sharp. What appeared to be its face was a blur of jagged lines, an abstract mask of twisted flesh and jagged teeth, as if reality itself had bent in response to its malevolent will. Ethan's hands, trembling violently, reached forward to the screen. The game, the thing, had pulled him in, and it wasn't letting him go. The game had become his life. It was everything now. It was all-consuming, like an infection that seeped into the very marrow of his bones, filling his mind with dread, with need. He needed to keep playing. He needed to survive. The screen flickered. The game was still there, still running, still waiting, but there was something wrong. The world on the screen had changed. It was no longer the simple, familiar landscape he had grown accustomed to. The city was distorted, twisted, as if reality itself had been warped by the presence of the creature. Buildings loomed at unnatural angles, windows cracked open like gaping wounds. The streets were empty, save for the shadowy figures that loomed in the distance, their eyes glowing with a terrible hunger. And then, something moved. Inside the game. A figure, dark and indistinct, slithered out from an alleyway. Its form was distorted, shifting in ways that made Ethan's blood run cold. It wasn't just a figure. It was a reminder of everything he had done, everything he had lost. The character he had once controlled, the one he'd shaped and nurtured in the game, was no longer his. It was alive. The screen flickered again, and Ethan's vision began to blur. The world around him seemed to grow distant, muffled. It was as if the walls were pressing in on him, suffocating him, drowning him in a void that stretched beyond the edges of the room. He felt himself being pulled deeper into the game, his body, his mind, his soul, all of them merging with the screen. No, this wasn't how it was supposed to happen. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. His fingers froze over the mouse, trembling violently as they hovered over the quit button. But it was no use. The cursor wouldn't budge. The game had taken control. It was in his hands, in his body, in his mind. There was no stopping it. Then, the voice. It was the same voice. The one that had whispered to him in the dark. The one that had taunted him, claimed him. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was an echo, a memory, a curse. It reverberated in his head, clawing at his consciousness. "You're mine now, Ethan." The words felt like a knife, a brand. He couldn't escape them. They were buried deep inside him, lodged in his brain like a parasite feeding on his fear. Ethan's eyes darted to the corner of the room again, where the creature had been lurking. It was still there, watching him, but now it wasn't just a figure in the shadows. It had begun to manifest, its form stretching, warping, as if it were taking shape from the darkness itself. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his breaths coming in rapid, shallow bursts. He tried to turn away, to look anywhere but at the creature, but it was too late. His body refused to move, his legs stiff, his mind trapped in the vice grip of terror. It was like being frozen in time, unable to escape the inevitable. The creature's mouth, if it could even be called that, opened, revealing a dark void, an abyss. The whispers swelled, becoming a chorus of tortured souls, each one pleading for release. But there was no release, not for Ethan, not for anyone. With a sudden, unnatural motion, the creature lunged forward, its hands, no, its claws, outstretched. Ethan's body screamed, but his limbs refused to respond. The screen before him shimmered, and the image of his own character, the avatar he had so carefully built, was no longer a reflection. It was no longer him. It had become something else, something darker. The game had infected him. It had taken control of everything he was, his body, his mind, his soul. Ethan's vision blurred once more. The creature's claws were upon him now, tearing at his skin, raking across his chest, leaving deep gashes that oozed black, oily blood. It was as if the very fabric of his reality was being torn apart, thread by thread, and he couldn't stop it. The room was spinning, disorienting, twisting, and in that moment, Ethan realized the terrible truth. There was no escape, not from the game, not from the creature, not from himself. The last thing Ethan saw before the world went dark was the glowing text on the screen. flashing in cruel mockery. Game over. And then, there was nothing. Chapter 6. The echoes of despair. The hours that followed Ethan's descent into the game's world were a blur, a series of fragmented images and sounds that clung to his mind like the stale scent of damp earth. His eyes never left the screen, even when his body begged him to look away. It was as though the game had burrowed itself into the very core of his being, and now it had become the air he breathed, the blood that pulsed through his veins. It wasn't merely a game anymore, it was a presence. The world outside his room had long since faded from his awareness. He hadn't noticed the way the sky had turned, or the shadows that crept unnaturally against the walls. Time had become a fog, a stretch of nothingness punctuated only by the pulsing glow of the monitor. The game, with its warped, sinister design, played on, and Ethan had no control over it. Every action felt as though it were guided by a force beyond his comprehension. His fingers twitched, reluctantly obeying the game's commands, navigating through landscapes of grotesque, decaying buildings, the remnants of a world once vibrant. The streets in the game were eerily quiet, except for the far-off, echoing sounds of distant cries. Was it the avatars he had once controlled? Were they calling out for him? "You never should have come here." The whispering voice, soft yet sharp, filled his ears, its presence like a shadow that passed over his thoughts. He could not ignore it. It was familiar, yet foreign, a voice wrapped in both pity and malice. It was the voice, the one that had begun to speak to him ever since that first night. But it was more than a voice. It was alive. Ethan leaned closer to the screen, his eyes fixed on the avatar he had once controlled. But it was no longer his avatar. The character had begun to evolve, distort, as though it had taken on a life of its own, fed by the darkness of the game's world. Its movements were erratic, jerking violently, as if it were being manipulated by something unseen. Its eyes, once a blank slate, were now staring at him. The avatar's gaze had become a direct, mocking connection to Ethan, an unspoken question that gnawed at the back of his mind. "What did you do?" Ethan recoiled, but his body was heavy, sluggish, as if the weight of the game itself had seeped into his limbs. He felt cold, his skin prickling in the stale air. The room around him seemed to close in, the walls pressing closer, suffocating him. The glow from the screen flickered again, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic, echoing within his skull. "You can't escape. You never could." The words wrapped themselves around his mind, tighter, like tendrils of a dark vine. Ethan gasped, his breath ragged, as the whispers took on a new tone, a tone that almost seemed to feed off his fear. The voice, it wasn't just one now. It was many, hundreds, thousands. They all spoke at once, overlapping each other, filling the room with an unnatural resonance that made the very walls tremble. Each voice was a layer upon layer of anguish, regret, and torment. Ethan. A hand, cold and clammy, rested on his shoulder, and the sensation jolted him upright in his chair. His body went rigid, and his head snapped to the side, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the darkness of the room and the flickering screen. But the sensation lingered. It lingered like a shadow clinging to his skin. The whispers continued, louder now. They surged, engulfing him, growing more insistent, more desperate. Ethan's heart raced, his blood pounding in his ears, but he couldn't look away. He couldn't escape the screen, couldn't break free from the game. The thing had him, and it wouldn't let him go. The avatar, the once silent, obedient figure on the screen, now moved in a direction all on its own. It wasn't following Ethan's commands anymore. It was doing its own bidding. Its body moved with precision, as if it had a mind of its own. No, it had a mind. Ethan's avatar was now aware. And worse, it was aware of him. "You made me, Ethan. Now you will watch me burn." The words echoed through the room, and the image of the avatar twisted on the screen, its once blank face now contorted into something monstrous. The eyes, those familiar glassy eyes, became hollow, blackened sockets that seemed to suck in the light around them. The smile that formed was jagged, unnatural, too wide, a grotesque mockery of something human. The game, it was feeding on his fear. Ethan knew that now. It wasn't a mere game. It was a conduit, a vessel for something far darker, something that had never belonged in the world of pixels and code. The avatar. It wasn't just part of the game. It was a vessel, a puppet that had become sentient, corrupted by the darkness that lay at the heart of the game. And it had taken everything from him. Everything he had built, everything he had loved. His own creation was now turning against him. The screen flickered again, and for a brief moment, the static cleared. The game's world had shifted. The city that once stood quiet, almost empty, had now become a war zone of chaos. The streets were no longer vacant. They were teeming with dark shapes, moving like shadows, slithering, crawling, their faces distorted and grotesque. They were not human. They were the game. And now they were hunting him. "Look what you've done to me." The voice, no longer a whisper, but a guttural growl, rumbled from the speakers. The figure on the screen was coming closer, its movements jerky but deliberate, each step bringing it closer to Ethan. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat, and he tried to pull his hands away from the keyboard, but they wouldn't move. It was as if his body had become a puppet on its own strings, and the game, that damnable thing, was controlling it. His fingers clung to the keys against his will, each movement forced, as if the game had learned how to bend him to its will. His mind screamed, "No," but his body obeyed. The screen in front of him warped again, the blackened figure of the avatar growing larger, more real. It stepped out from the screen, its form stretching, phasing through the boundaries of reality and digital existence. The words were no longer just echoes. They were a presence, a tangible force. "You can never leave. Not now." The room around Ethan shifted, becoming darker, colder, as if the air itself had thickened. He could hear the whispers louder now, echoing in his ears, swarming around him like an army of insects. They crawled under his skin, in his blood, seeping into his very soul. The game was no longer just on the screen. It had crossed over. It was inside him. Chapter 7. The Descent into Darkness. The night had swallowed the world outside Ethan's window, a suffocating blackness that pressed against the glass like a living thing. The shadows inside his room stretched impossibly long, twisting and contorting as if they were attempting to escape the confines of the walls. Ethan sat in front of his computer, his body tense, eyes fixed on the screen, not daring to look away. The game, his game, was no longer a mere distraction. It was an anchor that held him in place, a relentless force that refused to let him go. He had tried to stop, tried to walk away, but something within the game, something that was the game, kept him tethered. The whispering voices, soft at first, had grown louder, more desperate, more alive. They filled the air like a dense fog, surrounding him, clinging to his skin. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, figures that loomed just beyond his vision, shifting, flickering like memories half remembered. And always the sound of footsteps, heavy, slow, dragging, came from within the walls. In the beginning, it had been nothing more than a few strange glitches, the kind that made him think the game's code had corrupted itself, nothing more. But now, the glitches had taken on a life of their own, expanding beyond the digital realm. It wasn't just the game that was broken. It was reality. Ethan's breath was shallow, his chest tight. He had spent countless hours trying to reverse what had happened, trying to undo the damage, but the more he tried, the more the game resisted. It was like fighting against an ocean, each attempt to pull himself free only pushing him further under. He could feel it now, the pull. It was subtle at first, but undeniable. The game was calling to him. No longer content with merely consuming his attention, it was pulling him into its depths, into its twisted heart. The screen before him flickered again, its light casting a pallid glow on his face. The game's world had become darker, more warped. Buildings were crumbling, the sky a sickly yellow that bled into an inky black. But it wasn't the environment that caught Ethan's attention. It was the figure that stood in the center of the screen, the avatar. It had changed again, its features more defined, more grotesque. The eyes that once stared blankly at him now glowed, burning with an unnatural light, like twin stars on the edge of a collapsing universe. The smile that had once been twisted into something resembling joy was now a rictus grin, a hideous, jagged line stretching impossibly wide across the figure's face. "I'm here," the avatar whispered, the voice not coming from the speakers, but from somewhere deep inside Ethan's mind. It was as if the words reverberated in his skull, a jagged echo that rattled his bones. "You've been calling me. You can't stop me now." His pulse quickened, his heart hammering in his chest. This was it, he thought. This was the moment he had been dreading. This was the moment when the game would consume him completely. But there was no escape. The figure on the screen reached out. A slow, deliberate movement. And as its hand passed through the glass of the monitor, Ethan felt something cold brush against his skin. He jerked back, his breath catching in his throat, but it was too late. The hand had already touched him. The world shifted. Ethan's stomach churned, as if he were being pulled downward into an endless abyss. His body felt weightless, his limbs suspended in the air as if gravity had ceased to exist. The screen before him flickered again, and the next moment, the room around him dissolved. It was as if the boundaries between the physical world and the game were no longer there, and Ethan was now part of the digital nightmare. He was no longer sitting in his chair. He was standing in the middle of the game's world, surrounded by ruins. The streets were empty, but the air was thick with a presence that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Something was watching him. No, not just watching, waiting. The avatar was now standing before him, its form more real than he had ever seen it before. It was no longer confined to the screen. It was alive, its presence suffocating. Its eyes burned into Ethan's, an unblinking stare that seemed to pierce through to his very soul. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was soft, almost tender, but it carried a venomous undertone, a promise of pain and suffering. Ethan wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His throat was tight, his body frozen in place. He could not move. He could not run. He was trapped. And then, as if to confirm his worst fear, the world around him began to shift once again. The walls of the crumbling buildings began to warp, twisting like melting wax. The ground beneath his feet buckled and cracked, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Dark tendrils of smoke and shadow slithered from the cracks, coiling around his ankles, dragging him downward. Ethan struggled, but the more he fought, the more the shadows tightened their grip on him. The avatar stood motionless, watching, its grin growing wider, more sinister. "You created me," the avatar whispered, "and now I will make you a part of me." The shadows surged forward, engulfing Ethan's body. He screamed, but the sound was lost in the deafening silence that followed. It felt like being submerged underwater, unable to breathe, unable to move. His vision blurred as the darkness crept in, and for the briefest moment, he wondered if this was it, the end of everything. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The shadows receded. The avatar was gone. The game world, once a twisted reflection of reality, faded into a void of black. Ethan gasped, his chest rising and falling as he fought for breath. He was no longer standing in the game. He was back in his room, his body slumped in the chair, drenched in sweat. But the game was still there. The screen before him flickered, and the words appeared once again, written in jagged, twisted letters. "You are mine now." Ethan's hands trembled as they reached for the mouse. He tried to click away, to exit, but the screen remained frozen, unyielding. The words stayed, flickering like a heartbeat, pulsing with the rhythm of something alive. And then, a new message appeared, one that filled Ethan's mind with a cold, gnawing dread. There is no escape. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in on him, suffocating him. Ethan couldn't breathe. His heart raced, his mind racing to find an answer. But there was none. There was only the game, the endless game, and the avatar, now a part of him, a part of this twisted world. It was a parasite, a dark force that would never let him go. And just as Ethan finally understood the truth, that he had been trapped, ensnared by his own creation, the whispers returned. They were louder now, closer, more insistent. They were coming for him. Ethan could feel them in his bones, in his very blood. The game wasn't just playing him, it was feasting on him. It had already begun. Chapter 7. Part 2. The game within the game. Ethan's hands shook uncontrollably as they hovered over the keyboard. The cold sweat on his palms made it impossible to maintain a steady grip on the mouse. His body was still locked in the chair, the weight of the screen pressing down on him like an oppressive force. His heart thudded in his chest with every second, each beat echoing in the silence of the room. His mind raced, but it felt as though he were moving in slow motion, trapped within the relentless pull of the game. There is no escape. The words flashed again on the screen, like a malignant pulse that sent a chill down his spine. He had tried everything, unplugging the computer, restarting it, even pulling out the power cables, but nothing worked. The game was still there, still demanding his attention, still consuming his very essence. He felt the presence again, the cold weight that settled in his bones. It was there, just behind him, lingering in the periphery of his vision, like a shadow that refused to leave. The whispers had grown louder now, forming a chorus of voices that sounded almost like a chant, echoing in his mind. They were calling to him, beckoning him forward, urging him to continue. "You can't stop it," they whispered. "You can't run. You belong here now." Ethan's breathing became shallow. The room felt smaller, suffocating him. He could feel the walls closing in, the air thickening as though he were trapped in a dream. He was beginning to lose track of what was real. Was he still in his room? Or had the game consumed him completely? His thoughts tangled, spiraling downward like a spiral staircase with no end. The avatar, now standing at the center of the screen, no longer wore the same twisted, disjointed grin. Its face had contorted, its features morphing into something darker, more grotesque. The glowing eyes, once an eerie light, now flickered like dying embers, casting a sickly greenish hue across the screen. The shadows that had once only surrounded it seemed to move with a life of their own, writhing and twisting like serpents. It was not just an avatar anymore, it was something far worse. It had become an entity, a force that had transcended the limits of the game. The whispers grew louder still. "You've fed me. Now I will feed on you." Ethan wanted to scream, to do anything to escape the suffocating grip of the game, but no sound came. He was paralyzed, unable to move. His body was no longer his own. It was as if the game had taken control, woven itself into the very fabric of his being. His muscles were stiff, his fingers numb. He couldn't even close his eyes. A sudden shift in the atmosphere. The air turned cold, biting his skin like icy needles. A dark mist seemed to seep from the cracks in the walls, slowly enveloping him. He could feel it creeping up his legs, crawling along his arms. It smelled of damp earth and something rancid, like the remnants of decay, of forgotten graves. The more he tried to shake it off, the thicker the fog became, until it pressed against his skin like an iron shackle. He was no longer alone. He could feel it. The oppressive weight of something standing just beyond his reach, something watching him with malice. His mind screamed at him to run, to break free, but the world around him was becoming more distorted by the second. The game had pulled him into its depths, and now there was no way back. He was trapped. The voice came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the avatar speaking anymore. It was something else, something that did not belong to the world Ethan had once known. "You've seen what lies beneath the surface," the voice crooned, its tone low and hypnotic. "Now you will be a part of it. You will merge with me. With us." Ethan's heart pounded against his ribcage, each beat sending ripples of panic through his body. His vision blurred, the edges of the room fading into nothingness as the shadows swarmed him. The game was no longer just a screen. It was his reality, bending, twisting, consuming everything he knew. The whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, the sound overwhelming, maddening. It felt like his mind was being torn apart, each word a jagged piece of glass scraping across his consciousness. His grip on the mouse tightened, but the movement felt sluggish, as though the world was moving in slow motion. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The temperature dropped, his breath visible in the cold air. The game began to flicker, distorting like a broken television, the colors bleeding into each other. But then, something changed. The screen, once a window into an alternate world, now felt like a portal, a rift between two realities. The lines between the physical world and the game had all but disappeared. "You belong to me now." The voice reverberated in Ethan's skull, seeping into his very soul. His eyes widened in horror as he realized what was happening. He was becoming part of the game. It was no longer just a tool of entertainment. It was alive, and it had claimed him. The shadows in the room reached out like claws, wrapping themselves around his limbs, pulling him forward. His hands froze on the keyboard as the avatar on the screen moved, its grin widening, stretching impossibly wide. Its eyes, no longer just glowing, were now bleeding into the game world, dark tendrils of light curling around the figure like roots taking hold of the earth. And then, as the game's world bled into reality, Ethan's body was pulled forward, into the screen. The transition was excruciating. His skin felt like it was being stretched, his body contorted as if it were being torn apart and put back together. He could feel the cold fingers of the game's world grabbing hold of his very essence. There was no escape. The last thing Ethan saw before the world completely consumed him was the avatar's face, its eyes burning with the intensity of an unholy fire. It leaned forward, its lips parting in a twisted, triumphant grin. "Now you will never leave." Chapter 8. The game unravels. Ethan's senses were dulled, as if the very world around him had been sucked into a vacuum. He couldn't feel his hands anymore, couldn't hear the ambient noise of his house, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic outside. It was all gone. All that remained was the oppressive, unrelenting weight pressing in on him. It felt like the walls were shrinking, suffocating him, drawing closer with each agonizing breath. The game had become him. It wasn't just a thing on a screen anymore. It was an extension of his consciousness, a living nightmare that fed on his very soul. He wanted to scream, to claw at the reality he once knew, but no sound came. The words that haunted his mind now were not his own. They came from the game. It was talking to him. "Welcome to your new home," the voice echoed inside his skull. It was soft, soothing, almost seductive in its familiarity, as if it knew the very fabric of his fears. The avatar, once a mere image on a screen, now stood beside him, its grotesque, ever-shifting form watching him with that same eerie grin, its glowing eyes like twin lanterns in the dark. Ethan tried to move his body, but it felt like he was bound to the chair. His muscles were frozen, his bones aching with a coldness that radiated deep inside him. The skin on his arms prickled as if something invisible was brushing against him, like unseen fingers trailing down his spine. But no matter how much he tried to fight it, the game was winning. It had already taken control. Functionally, the air in the room began to distort, ripples of heat rising from the screen as if the game were alive, breathing, pulsing with a malevolent life force. Ethan's eyes widened as the boundary between reality and the game continued to fade. The walls, once solid and grounded in the physical world, began to flicker like a broken television set. Objects around him, once familiar, turned alien, warped, blurry outlines that no longer made sense. His own reflection in the monitor now looked like a strange, distorted figure, his eyes sunken and dark, his face gaunt, as if the very essence of him was being drained away. Suddenly, the voice spoke again, louder this time. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through the air, vibrating in his chest, making his teeth ache. "You have chosen your fate, Ethan. There is no going back. You have fed me, and now I shall feed on you." The walls began to bleed black smoke, the air thickening with the stench of rot and decay. The screen blinked rapidly, the distorted face of the avatar flickering in and out of view like a maddening hallucination. For a moment, Ethan thought he could see something else behind the avatar. A dark, swirling mass of shadows that reached out, clawing at the edges of the screen. Something ancient, something otherworldly. And then, the game changed. The graphics twisted violently, the once smooth animation distorting into jagged, horrific shapes. The avatar's face stretched wider, its eyes now like gaping holes, dark and infinite, pulling at the very fabric of Ethan's soul. As its smile grew, its mouth seemed to unhinge, extending impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, like the mouth of a predator waiting to devour him whole. Ethan screamed. His throat burned with the effort, but no sound came. The game responded. No more running, no more hiding. You are mine. The shadows began to move. At first, it was subtle, a slight darkening of the air, a shift in the light. But then, they began to reach toward him. Long, twisting fingers of darkness slid from the screen, curling around his limbs like chains, tightening with every breath he took. His arms screamed in pain, the pressure unbearable. The shadows wrapped themselves around him, pulling him toward the monitor, dragging him into the black abyss of the screen. Ethan fought with everything he had left. His legs kicked, his hands twisted against the restraints of invisible forces. He could feel the cold fingers of the game sinking deeper into his skin, crawling beneath the surface like liquid ice. His vision blurred, everything around him spinning into chaos. He could feel himself slipping. His body lurched forward, his face slammed against the monitor, the screen cold and smooth against his skin. For a moment, he felt as if he were falling into a void, falling through the screen itself into a world that had no end, no beginning, no escape. Suddenly, the world around him shifted. The room was gone. The walls, the chair, the computer. They were all lost, dissolved into nothingness. In their place, a vast, endless void stretched out before him. The air was thick with shadows, a tangible darkness that enveloped him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. All that remained was the deafening silence that pressed down on him like a heavy weight. And then, through the silence, came a sound, a low growling hum that vibrated in his chest. The ground beneath him began to tremble, and from the abyss, something emerged, a shape crawling toward him, its form twisted and unnatural, bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The figure was humanoid, but its features were warped beyond recognition. Its limbs were too long, its hands clawed, its face a mass of shifting shadows. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as it drew closer. He couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away. There was something wrong about this thing, something ancient and powerful, like a god of darkness rising from the deep. The figure stopped in front of him, its form shifting like liquid, its eyes glistening like twin orbs of liquid gold. It reached out with one of its clawed hands, and for a moment, Ethan thought it was going to touch him. His heart raced, every instinct screaming at him to flee, but his body wouldn't respond. "You are not free, Ethan." The voice came again, this time not from the game, but from this thing, from this creature that now stood before him, its grin spreading wider. The shadows shifted, forming tendrils that wrapped around him, drawing him closer to the entity's face. "You have become a part of me. There is no escape." Chapter 8. The Game. Unravels, Part 2. The darkness was no longer just an oppressive weight, it was an entity, alive and breathing. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears as the shadows crept ever closer, their tendrils curling around his limbs, pulling him deeper into the abyss. He could feel his body trembling, each shudder racking his bones, but it was as if his muscles were no longer under his control. The more he tried to scream, the more his mouth felt sealed, as if the very air itself had become a suffocating force, refusing to let him breathe. The entity loomed before him, a massive figure rising from the pitch-black void. Its features were ever-changing, never quite settling into something recognizable. Faces flickered across its surface, some human, some monstrous, all twisted with pain and rage. It had no shape, only a mass of shifting shadows and broken memories. The faintest hint of its jagged, gnashing teeth appeared from within the darkness as its hunger filled the space around him. It had no eyes, no clear form, but Ethan could feel its gaze, cold and malignant, penetrating every part of him. The words came, not in his mind, but outside it, so close, so real that they felt like a physical blow. "You think you can escape? There is no escape." The voice was low and guttural, reverberating through his body as though it had risen from the very bowels of the earth. Each word seemed to drag the world further into chaos. Ethan shook his head violently, as if denying it would make the nightmare end. He could feel his fingers twitch, his skin crawling beneath the pressure of the shadows tightening around him. And yet, his body betrayed him. He wanted to move, wanted to fight. But the more he struggled, the more the darkness pressed in on him. Like a vice, like the walls were closing around him from all sides. He tried to look away, tried to focus on anything other than the horrid thing that hovered before him, but its presence consumed him. His entire world had shrunk to the vast, impossible emptiness, and the grotesque figure before him. The shape shifted again, and this time, the face that emerged from the swirling shadows was unmistakable. It was his own. His heart stopped. He recoiled, eyes wide with disbelief. The twisted form of himself leered back at him, a grotesque parody of who he was, its features contorted in a permanent grimace of agony. His reflection in this entity's image was a mockery, sunken eyes that stared back with a cold malice, skin drawn tight across his bones, mouth stretched wide in an eternal, silent scream. You thought you could defy me. You thought you could control me. Ethan staggered back as his reflection began to move on its own, independent of his every action. It grinned, a mocking expression painted across its face, its fingers twitching in the air like claws. The shadows closed in around him, and he was powerless to stop them. It wasn't just the game anymore. It was everywhere. It had seeped into him, into his very soul. He had failed. "This is your final level," the voice continued, echoing from everywhere, filling every crevice of the void. "You are mine now, Ethan. You always were." A surge of panic rushed through him. The thought of losing his own identity, the thought of being consumed by this thing, of becoming nothing more than a puppet in the game's dark grasp, was unbearable. His chest constricted, every breath a struggle. His body ached with the need to flee, but he was trapped, bound by invisible chains, helpless as the game closed in on him. And then, the screen before him flickered again. The distorted face of the avatar appeared, now fully materialized in front of him, like a cruel god come to collect its prize. Its features had become even more monstrous, its smile grotesque and hungry. The eyes, those glowing orbs that had once been so captivating, were now dark pools of nothingness. A sickening, distorted laugh echoed from its mouth. "You wanted to play with me. You wanted to unlock the secrets. Well, now you've earned them." The game had stopped being a game. Ethan's thoughts scrambled. This was no longer a challenge. This was no longer a virtual world with rules, with escapes. He had fallen into it. It had absorbed him, swallowed him whole, and now it was taking him somewhere. Somewhere beyond the reach of time and reality. There was no final screen, no credits rolling in the corner, no game over. Only the infinite void of endless, swirling darkness. The ground beneath his feet began to crack. Shards of black stone erupted from the surface, splitting and falling into the abyss. The air trembled, vibrating with an energy that felt alive. Unnaturally so. Ethan tried to steady himself, but the very earth he stood upon seemed to disintegrate with every movement. He could see the very fibers of reality tearing apart before his eyes, like fabric unraveling. The entity spoke again, its voice softer now, almost coaxing. "Don't resist. You're part of me now. Just accept it." And in that moment, something clicked inside Ethan's mind. He had been fighting the wrong battle. The entity was not trying to destroy him. It had already done so. What it sought was not his destruction, but his submission, his acceptance. For a split second, the image of his own reflection flickered again. This time, its eyes were different. They were no longer the hollow, empty pits that stared back at him. They were his. His own eyes, filled with fear, but also something more. Something that wanted to understand, to solve the mystery that had haunted him from the very beginning. Chapter 9. The final move. Ethan's eyes snapped open, but the world around him was no longer familiar. It wasn't the dim-lit room where he had once sat with the screen flickering before him. It wasn't even the black void he had felt himself descending into moments ago. This place was something else, a place neither bound by time nor by space, a cold, inescapable realm where reality bent and folded like some grotesque origami. He tried to breathe, but the air was thick, suffocating, as if the atmosphere itself was alive, watching, waiting for something. His chest felt tight, every inhale a struggle against the weight pressing in on him. His skin felt clammy, like it didn't quite belong to him anymore, like it was an afterthought, the first layer to be shed. A cold sweat clung to him, and the hairs on the back of his neck prickled, an instinctive reaction to the oppressive presence surrounding him. The ground beneath him was blackened and slick, as if it had been burnt, charred to an inky residue. The faintest flickers of distorted lights danced in the air, casting strange, long shadows that warped and stretched in unnatural angles. The shadows felt alive, slinking around him like hungry serpents, constantly shifting and reaching for his legs. In the distance, just beyond the range of his limited vision, he could hear the faintest of whispers. Voices, too many to count. Some of them were human, others were not. There were cries, pleas, and guttural noises that sent shivers down his spine. They echoed from all directions, as though the very air had become an echo chamber for the lost and the damned. "No," Ethan whispered, his throat dry, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. He didn't know what he was refusing, didn't know who he was speaking to, but the word slipped out, hoarse and trembling. Something deep in his chest told him this was not just some glitch, some bad trip brought on by too much screen time. No, this was real. And it was worse than anything his mind had dared to imagine. The whispers were getting louder, intensifying, crawling deeper into his mind, worming their way through the crevices of his sanity. A loud crack split the air, and the ground trembled beneath him. Ethan staggered, his legs almost buckling as something powerful, something vast stirred around him. The whispering stopped, replaced by a low, guttural rumble. It felt as if something massive was approaching, something that could swallow him whole, something that had been waiting for him. And then, the shadows before him began to shift again. From the darkness, a figure emerged, a figure that seemed to exist outside of the normal rules of perception. Its body seemed to be made of shifting black and grey clouds, distorted and fluid, yet it had a presence that filled the entire space. It was massive, towering over him, its shape fluctuating like liquid metal. Its face, or what could have been a face, was barely visible, a blur of distorted features that seemed to fold in on themselves, as though they could never quite settle into anything coherent. Eyes, countless eyes, appeared in places where they should not have been, watching him, blinking, flickering. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This was the entity, the thing behind the game. The thing that had swallowed his life whole and left nothing but a dark, twisted reflection of it. "You were always going to lose," the entity's voice boomed, not from its mouth, but from the very air itself. It reverberated through his skull, rattling his teeth. There was no escape from it. It was in the walls, in the ground, in his mind, everywhere. "No," Ethan gasped, his knees giving way beneath him. "No, I didn't. This wasn't supposed to happen. The figure loomed closer, its swirling, shifting form like the storm clouds before a tornado. There was no more time for argument. Ethan's voice died in his throat as a sense of overwhelming terror suffocated him. It was not just a fear of death, but a fear of becoming, of being consumed by something that was greater than him, something ancient, unfathomable. "You should have known better," the entity continued, its tone cruel, like a teacher scolding a child who had failed a test. "You thought you could cheat the game. You thought you could escape, but the rules were never yours to break. The game owns you, Ethan. It has always owned you." With every word, the darkness around him grew more intense. The air thickened, became suffocating. Ethan could feel his mind fragmenting, slipping into pieces. Every corner of his perception warped, distorted, until there was nothing left but the presence of the entity and the gnawing feeling that it had always been here, waiting for him. "You wanted to know the truth," the voice continued, its mocking tone ringing in his ears. The truth is that the game isn't a game. It's life. Your life. And it has never ended. It will never end. You've already lost, Ethan. There is no ending. There's only this. Ethan's vision blurred, his body shaking uncontrollably as a deep, bottomless feeling of despair overwhelmed him. He wanted to scream, wanted to fight back, but he was paralyzed, caught in a web of fear and inevitability. The entity's form shifted again, this time forming into something more solid, more human-like. But even then, it was only a mockery of humanity. Its face was still a grotesque distortion, its body unnaturally elongated, arms stretching down to the ground like some broken marionette. And yet, the face, the eyes that gleamed with malice, they were unmistakably human. It was him. It was him, twisted and corrupted by the game. Ethan's breath hitched in his chest as he stumbled backward, hands reaching out in a futile attempt to ward it off. But the figure stepped forward, and as it did, the world around him began to shatter. The edges of reality cracked open, revealing a nightmarish chasm, a void that stretched on forever, an abyss that threatened to consume everything in its path. Ethan tried to call out, tried to fight, but the words felt like they were choking him. He could barely think, let alone act. His body was no longer his own. The game had already won. The world folded around him, the entity's form expanding, swallowing the last remnants of Ethan's reality. The whispers started again, louder now, all around him. Voices from the past, voices from the present, voices from a future that had yet to be written. They all spoke at once, echoing in the infinite darkness. They were all him. And then, just as his mind began to crack under the pressure, just as the last vestiges of his identity shattered completely, a soft, disembodied voice whispered, too faint to comprehend, "You're free now." Chapter 10. The Final Loop. Ethan woke, but not in the way he was used to. The transition was almost imperceptible, like slipping from one moment to the next without ever fully realizing it had happened. For a fleeting second, he thought it was over. Perhaps this was some kind of twisted dream, a nightmare that would fade with the morning light. He breathed deeply, drawing in the cold, unfamiliar air around him. But then, he felt the weight of the presence again, the pressure, the sickening sense that he was not alone. It was everywhere, suffocating, closing in on him. The shadows, the whispers, they never left. He opened his eyes. The room before him was the same cracked walls, the same flickering lights overhead. It was the room from before, the one he had been trapped in for what felt like an eternity. His heart raced, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. His body seemed to be trapped in some kind of limbo, his mind still reeling from the events that had led him here. He blinked, trying to clear the fog in his head. The walls were too familiar, too real. He could taste the stale air in his mouth, the metallic tang of sweat. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, as if the walls themselves were leaching the warmth from his body. But there was something new. A strange sense of déjà vu gnawed at him, something unsettling in the repetition. No, this wasn't just the same room. It was worse. This was the beginning again. But now he understood. Now he knew. The game hadn't ended. It couldn't end. The entity had made that clear. There was no release. There was no freedom. The walls of this place, this prison of his mind, were shifting and closing in, trapping him in an infinite cycle, an unbroken loop, a place where time lost all meaning. He heard the whispers again. "Ethan." The voice was softer this time, quieter, almost a gentle caress against the back of his mind. But there was nothing gentle about it. The voice was a warning, a beckoning. He turned, but no one was there. "You should have known," the voice whispered, colder now. "The end was always here. It was always waiting for you." Ethan's skin crawled as the realization hit him like a sudden jolt. The entity, no, it, hadn't just been haunting him. It had consumed him. From the moment he had made that first connection, from the moment he had played the game, he had sealed his fate. There was no escape. It was more than just a game, more than a mere construct. It was a part of him now. He tried to move, but his body was uncooperative. It was as though his muscles refused to obey his commands. His chest tightened with the realization there was no fight left in him. This wasn't just a physical prison, it was a mental one, a spiritual one. The room shifted. The walls grew tighter, pressing in on him. He could feel the ground beneath him vibrating, as if the very foundation of this nightmare was alive. The air became thick, oppressive, like a weight was slowly bearing down on him from all sides. And then before him a door appeared. It wasn't just any door, it was a black door, the kind you couldn't quite focus on. Like a void of darkness had been sculpted into the shape of a door. Its edges were jagged, frayed, as though it had been torn from reality itself. A cold mist leaked from the cracks around it, the same mist that had surrounded him earlier. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He knew what it meant. The door. It was his only way out, but how could he even contemplate it? The door was like a trap designed to tempt him. He knew that. He knew. The moment he walked through, the cycle would start again. He would be trapped forever, just like the game, just like everything that had come before. But there was no choice. Not really. Because the whispers were getting louder. The voices were growing more desperate, and the ground beneath his feet was trembling as though something vast and ancient was awakening from the depths of this nightmare. Something that had been waiting for him. Waiting for this moment. With shaky hands, Ethan stood, his legs trembling beneath him. The world around him seemed to tilt, and the blackness of the door was growing. No, pulling him in. He had to go. He had to face it, whatever it was. Stepping forward, each movement felt like it took an eternity. His body ached, but his mind screamed with an overwhelming sense of urgency, of purpose. He could feel the door now, its dark presence pressing against his very soul, beckoning him closer. As his fingers brushed the cold metal of the door, a sharp, unearthly crack split the air, and the room around him seemed to fall apart. The walls crumbled, the floor cracked, and the darkness rushed toward him, swallowing everything. Ethan felt the air sucked out of his lungs, a sudden pressure that made him choke, but still, his hand clutched the door. The whispers were deafening now. It's too late. He stepped through the door. The world shifted again, and Ethan was falling faster than he could understand, faster than his mind could process. It was as though he was being ripped apart, his consciousness being dragged through endless stretches of darkness. The sounds of the whispers grew louder, surrounding him, growing unbearable. The door had never truly opened. It had been a lie. The fall was infinite, a descent that never seemed to stop. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears, his own breaths ragged in the void. Every muscle in his body screamed as it was pulled apart. But there was no escape. There was no end. And then, just when he thought he could not endure any longer, a flash of light. It was blinding, dazzling. An explosion of pure, overwhelming brightness that tore through the darkness, ripping apart the very fabric of his being. Ethan's scream was swallowed by the light. The last shred of his will shredded into nothingness. The light consumed him, and then there was nothing.